Dr. Chana Davis. I'm a geneticist and contributing writer at Those Nerdy Girls. My guest today is Dr. Sara Gorman, a fellow nerdy girl who is passionate about fighting science denial and has deep expertise in gun violence and a bunch of other areas that we won't be covering today. Sara, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Gorman. My interests and training are in the intersection of psychology and public health. I focus on misinformation and the psychology of science denial and wrote a book that was recently updated in 2021 called Denying to the Grave. I'm also just submitted a new book manuscript called Vital Signs, which is about medical mistrust and conspiracy theories in the United States. And I'm the founder of Critica, which is a nonprofit that focuses on science communication and counteracting medical misinformation. I've had a longstanding interest in issues around gun violence and especially around myths and misconceptions about gun violence in the United States, which formed a big portion of my book, Denying to the Grave. So I'm looking forward to discussing this obviously very important topic today.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion. It's been so horrifying to see all the headlines about shootings this year, and I know that those headlines are just the tip of the iceberg. I also know there's a lot of myths about gun violence, and so I'm glad you're here to help set the record straight. I just want to mention that today's discussion is a little bit different than what we normally do for Those Nerdy Girls. Normally, our discussion is more of a direct Q&A taken from our question box on the Nerdy Girls website. But this one was more driven by just a topic that this whole group really felt strongly needed to be fleshed out and discussed, and more awareness, more education. So we'll do our best to keep an eye on the chat for questions that come in. But in general, we shape our questions very much around what comes into our question box. So if you have questions for us, encourage you to submit them to our website, thosenerdygirls.org. So let's jump in, Sara. Why is gun violence considered a public health crisis? So a little bit more, but why is this a relevant topic for those nerdy girls?
Sure. So gun violence is in many ways a very traditional public health problem because it follows certain patterns. There's thought to be some contagion around gun violence and where certain areas may be hotspots for gun violence, and the behavior is actually somewhat contagious. And injury prevention, of which gun violence is a part, is a huge part of public health. So it really is important to think about sort of the epidemiological trends around where gun violence is happening, how exposure to it is perpetuating it, and the downstream effects on people's mental health and physical health of being exposed to gun violence.
Oh, and I know you have some links ready, so I'll pop those in for people that want to learn more because we can't do everything as in depth as we'd like to, right?
Right.
Anything else you wanted to say before we move on to the next one?
I did just want to mention, I know we will talk about this a lot more as we go, but obviously one of the contributors to some forms of gun violence, especially obviously suicide, is mental illness or mental health issues. So that also makes it really a health issue to look at as well.
So let's start to get a sense of the size and scope of the problems because you really can't get that from a headline. Often you just get a very biased picture. So can you help get us paint the picture of how big of a problem this is in the U.S. and share some statistics and some other context of how the U.S. compares to other parts of the world?
Sure. So I have some statistics here about where we are in terms of gun violence deaths just this year in 2023, and also how we compare to some other developed countries. So far in 2023, there have been 200, more than 200 mass shootings in the U.S. We estimate that about every day, 120 Americans are killed by gun violence, and more than 200 are shot and wounded. We also know this is a huge issue in the domestic violence arena. So about 70 women per month are shot and killed in domestic violence disputes. And gun deaths probably represent around 20% of all injury deaths. That was the percentage in 2021, according to the CDC. And injury deaths include things like poisoning and motor vehicle accidents. So gun deaths are right up there with motor vehicle accidents, which used to, really far surpass gun deaths and gun violence. This is also and has become, since the pandemic, really a huge issue among teens and young adults. So, since 2020, guns have been the leading cause of death for teens and young adults up to age 18, whereas before it was motor vehicle accidents. So, it surpassed car accidents in that particular population. And I'll also say, as of May 1st, we know that at least 13,000 people have died by guns in 2023, and there have been roughly 66 suicides by gun each day this year in 2023. So, and in terms of other countries, unfortunately, the US, as many of you probably know, surpasses almost all other developed nations in terms of gun violence and gun deaths. So, we're looking at about 22 times greater for example, firearm homicides in the US compared to all the countries in the European Union. And we also know that gun violence and deaths is very correlated with how lax gun laws are in certain states. So states like Alaska and Louisiana that have very lax gun laws also have more gun violence and gun deaths.
That's a lot to wrap your head around. One thing that you alluded during these stats to the fact that things have gotten worse, and that maybe guns are overtaking things that they didn't used to, where the gun deaths are more than auto accidents, and they used to be fewer than, or in the same league. But yeah, I'm just wondering about the trajectory a little bit more. If you could comment on that, and is it kind of been a slow and steady increase, or is there some sort of inflection point where it's what's the trajectory in the U.S.?
It's definitely getting worse, I think, with each passing year, especially for teens and young adults. I think there's a real concern around this population because we're also seeing a mental health crisis in that population. And we're seeing a rise in suicide in that population. And I will also say that in places where, and we'll probably get into this more, but in places where it kind of is a situation that perpetuates itself because in places where there are school shootings, we also see higher rates of suicide among, other
Right.
youths in that area. So this is a problem that's really feeding on itself, and it
Right.
definitely got significantly worse during the pandemic as well.
Well, I'm going to share some links because it's a lot to wrap your head around, and so people can look up some of these stats themselves. You shared one from healthdata.org, and then we have a recent post from those nerdy girls. Thank you to MK for that. And there's some more stats and some more links in that one as well. So let's talk a bit more about the impacts of gun violence. So most of the statistics you gave were deaths and injuries, but I'm sure obviously there are impacts beyond just what those numbers capture. So can you speak a little bit to the broader impacts of gun violence?
Well, one thing we have to keep in mind is that gun violence and gun deaths are usually tied to other social and public health issues. So, in areas where there are high rates of gun violence and gun death, there also tends to be high rates of other forms of violence, trauma, especially for young people, domestic violence, as I mentioned before, and mental health issues. So, these issues sort of all surround each other and go together. And we also know that, as I said before, school shootings are correlated with a higher rate of antidepressant use in youth, as well as suicides in the years following those events. And so those are having an obvious sort of immediate impact on everyone. And there's also some speculation, it's harder to prove this, but there's some speculation that the overall state of mental health especially among young adults and teens, has gotten worse in part because they're exposed to all of these news stories about how there are mass shootings, there are school shootings, and there's this feeling of lack of safety. We also know that gun violence is associated in certain communities is associated with aggression, criminal involvement in the criminal justice system. Again, that's especially prevalent for young people who are exposed at a young age to gun violence, and also school performance is usually affected negatively by high rates of gun violence in certain communities.
Yeah, I mean, the picture is just beyond gruesome when you think about the knock-on effects, like you more violence, but also just so much mental and emotional impact.
Mhm. Yeah.
I know you have a couple links there. Do you want to say anything about one's from kff.org, another from Everytown Research? Again,
Yeah, I would just point out, I was going to point this out later too, that every town for gun safety is a really good resource just for understanding the scope of the problem and for advocacy efforts about gun violence, especially in that younger population.
so let's start to get into causes, because I know there's a lot of myths and misconceptions. But so, what are some of the things we do know? What are some of the things we don't know?
So there's actually, even though there's now, thankfully, a pretty sustained discussion about this topic, there's actually a lot we don't know. And part of this is because, again, this issue has become so politicized. And in the 1990s, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, actually persuaded Congress to cut off CDC's funding if they directly studied gun violence and the
Whoa.
results of gun violence. So the CDC sort of has this gag rule where they can't really produce a lot of data or track a lot of data on this issue. So we're kind of missing, we are actually, still suffering the effects of that and missing some of the information that we really need on this topic. So that is just one thing to keep in mind when we think about sort of, what are the causes of gun violence and even some of the epidemiology about gun violence and gun deaths. But I would say, I mean, I know we're going to talk again about myths and misconceptions. One thing that is probably not true is that mental illness is always a cause of gun violence. It is true that suicide is a major source of gun death in this country, and that is associated with mental illness. But the idea that people with mental illness are inherently more violent than other people is just not true. I think a lot of gun violence, like I said before, there is some evidence that gun violence can be contagious. So in communities where there's a lot of pre-existing unrest and guns and gun violence prevalent, there are higher rates of that behavior continuing in younger generations. So that is, sort of the contagiousness and the spread of the behavior within certain communities is important to understand. And then, as I said before, also, there is a big significant factor here just about the availability of guns. So in places where guns are less available or restricted in some way, there is really less gun violence and fewer gun deaths as well.
Yeah. Do you know off the top of your head how much of a difference are we talking about, like from state to state, and how much can the differences in gun violence rates from place to place within states be kind of explained by just how many guns there are?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know pretty well just by doing state to state comparisons. Even states that are near each other are similar in a lot of ways, but have different gun laws. We can see that there is a very different situation in terms of the rate of violence and death. So a lot of people will say, for example, that gun violence is not affected by gun laws because people find loopholes and illegal ways to get guns, and so it's the same thing no matter what. And some of that is true. It is true that people, do have ways of getting guns and getting around the law. But if you think about certain issues like suicide that really make up a huge portion of gun injuries and gun deaths in this country, most of those people are not getting guns through illegal means. They're getting guns through legal means, and when the guns are not available, those suicides actually tend not to happen. So the rates of death are much lower by gun in those situations. So I don't know. I don't have off the top of my head sort of a number like twice as much, three times as
Yeah.
much, but it is significantly different in states that have different laws.
Yeah. Well, that says a lot,
Yeah.
right? I'm just going to drop a link that you shared, a Vox article about some mass shootings,
Mhm.
for people to learn more about that. So let's move on to talk some more about myths and misconceptions. I know this is a area of expertise for you. So, what are some of the biggest myths and misconceptions about gun violence?
So when I set out to write Denying to the Grave, and the first topic I was really interested in terms of science denial was it was anti-vaccine ideas, but I realized very quickly that there are actually a lot of sort of non-evidence-based ideas about guns that really affect people's behavior and make us less safe. So, for example, one of the things that I heard a lot is that people say they want a gun because they think it'll make them more safe. So it'll make them and their family more safe in case somebody breaks in or somebody threatens them. They'll have a gun to respond. And in reality, that is really a myth because there are data to show that, first of all, the rates of people breaking and entering in a violent way are really very low for the most part. Obviously, there are robberies and things that happen, but the rate of violence associated with those things is usually pretty low. When people have a gun, when there is violence, there is sort of a slight escalation in these situations. When you have a gun to respond to that, usually just escalates the situation more and makes it more dangerous. So that's another issue. And usually, the vast majority of the time, when people have guns in their home, it ends up being killing one of the family members, either through an accident, through suicide, or through domestic violence. Those are really the most common ways that people are killed by guns in the household. So again, very rare event that you would actually have to confront an intruder with a gun to save yourself, but much more likely to happen is that there's a tragic event within your family in the household. So having a gun in your home makes you a lot less safe. So that's the first major misconception. Another one that I mentioned earlier is that mental illness is at the root cause of most gun violence incidents. And we see this comes up time and again, in a way to deflect attention, I think, from talking about gun control. People say that, in situations like mass shootings, that the problem is mental illness and we need to solve that problem. And it has nothing to do with whether or not someone has a gun. And I think, it is true. It's a little bit complicated because it is true that, there are mass shooters who have mental health issues. Some of them are suicidal and do end up killing themselves, and that is part of the situation. But we know on balance that people with mental health issues or mental illness are much less likely to be perpetrators of violence in general, including gun violence, and much more likely to be victims of violence. So for the most part, with the exception of suicide, which, guns can be very involved with and make much more lethal, mental illness is not a major driver of gun violence in this country or anywhere. So that's another major misconception. And that sort of goes along with this idea that when people say guns don't kill people, people kill people, is another major misconception because, as I was alluding to before, the availability and the access people have to guns makes a really big difference in just the overall death rate and injury rate in this country. So, it really is the issue of the availability of the guns, not the intention of the people that makes the situation more dangerous.
I think it's really important to really have the facts on this, because I think it's very easy to have a distorted perspective of the situation just based on headlines, and headlines combined with, our natural instincts or the way we think, where we worry about certain types of things are more likely to worry us than the ones that are actually more likely to happen. And so you might be inclined to want to protect yourself against a super rare event, but not realize that by doing so, you're actually bringing upon yourself a greater risk.
Yes, it's very tricky because there's this thing called the availability bias, which readers of those nerdy girls should know about because we've written about that a number of times. And it's tied up with this idea of risk perception, where things that are really available in your mind seem riskier than things that aren't. And the things that are available in your mind are things that got a lot of media coverage. And so we know that, mass shootings, school shootings get a lot of media attention. And sometimes people, out of fear, think that they should, have a gun or that there should be more armed people in schools because they have to ward off these events. But in reality, what we know is that, from a risk perception perspective, the suicide risk is much higher than the mass shooting risk. And having a gun is a major risk factor for for lethal suicide happening. So the reality is that having more guns, again, makes us less safe.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of an interview I did with an endocrinologist talking about bone health, and she was saying people might avoid taking these bone health medications because they're worried about really severe yet rare side effects. But if you don't take it, you're very likely going to have a fall or something that's actually going to, have a significant impact as well. And there's so many examples of
Right.
where our risk thinking is not on point.
It can be very distorted. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and none of us are immune to it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to drop the link in that you have here on this topic to learn a little bit more myths about debunking myths about gun violence. So the last thing that I really want to hear about, and I'm sure everyone else does, is what can we do to be part of the solution? It really it just feels very overwhelming and disheartening, and you can feel very helpless about. So what can we do?
Thanks for asking that question. We don't always talk about what we can do, and it's such a difficult topic. And it is a difficult topic, and it's a very complex, socially laden topic that is hard. As I said before, it's even hard to understand the root causes of the rate of violence and death that we have by guns in this country. But there are some things we can do. One is, I think having these kinds of conversations outside of like an immediate event like a school or mass shooting is important, because there does tend to be, I think I even wrote an article at one point that said our short attention span about guns or something. And the point there was that we do have these sort of rallying cries and discussions and want to take political action when there's a big event like a mass shooting. But the everyday tragedies that I talked about suicide and domestic violence, are really, really the issue that we need to also really focus on. And there just isn't sustained attention to this issue. So I think
Yeah.
on everyone's to-do list should be to continually draw attention to this topic and just keep talking about it, keep bringing it up with your representatives, even outside of when there's a major event, because I think that sustained attention is important. I also think that thinking about some of the more mental health issues, and understanding more holistically the suicide risk and the approaches that we can take to prevent that. There are evidence-based strategies to help, reduce the risk that people will take their lives with a gun. And so we need to, be actively thinking about and advocating. And then there are some really wonderful organizations that work on gun violence prevention. I mentioned one before, Every Town for Gun Safety, which is kind of a grassroots organization, but they also do really excellent research on this topic. So just educating yourself using those resources, but also if you can support their work, spread the word about these organizations, and if you can financially support them is also always helpful. So there are a few of these. Every Town for Gun Safety is one. There's also Moms Demand Action, which is sort of an offshoot of Every Town that's focused on, which is actually was started by a group of moms of survivors of survivor moms whose children died as a result of gun violence. And that's a big advocacy group. And there are some other, there's some academic based organizations, like Johns Hopkins has a center for gun violence that does a lot of good research. So just educating yourself using some of those resources as well it is a useful thing to do.
I'm dropping some links in now. So I dropped in Every Town, Moms Demand Action. You said Johns Hopkins Public Health.
Yeah.
And Giffords is something you mentioned.
Yeah. So that's sort of a advocacy organization / sort of center that studies. That organization has some more information about sort of legislative action and policy actions that should be taken to prevent gun violence. So that's also a good place to be able to contribute to that.
Sandy Hook Promise. Anything to say about
Sandy
that
Hook
one?
Promise is an organization that arose after the school shooting in Sandy Hook, and is a really great, again, sort of grassroots advocacy organization that focuses on preventing school shootings, preventing gun violence that affects especially children and teens. So also just a very good place to contribute, learn, support as well.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for sharing your expertise today. I can't believe it, but we actually finished a couple of minutes early. So that's good. This will balance out all the ones that go over. Any last tidbits you wanted to put out there that didn't fit the questions that we outlined in advance?
I would just say that it's really important to understand, again, as I said, that this problem is a complex problem. So any complex problem is going to have multiple causes, it's going to have multiple impacts on society, and it's going to be very hard to sort of sustain any kind of narrative that's sort of single-minded about why this is happening and what it means. So that should give you a little bit of a tip off to avoid any, to avoid some of these myths that oversimplify what this issue is really about. It is very complex.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's always good to just sort of keep a hold on that concept. And I think it is common to feel sort of helpless about this issue. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think I think this issue and things like climate change, are just very difficult things to try to intervene on, because sometimes it just feels like the problem is so big, and there's a lot of resistance in both of those cases to the
Mm-hmm.
science on these topics, and there's a lot of political sort of pushback that happens. But I would
Mm-hmm.
say, continue. It's always anything that you can do in this arena is worthwhile, even if it seems small. Bringing up a conversation with people to talk about this issue,
Mm-hmm.
donating $5 to an organization that works on this issue. It all counts. So,
Mm-hmm.
so don't. I would just say don't give up hope, and try to really be educated about what this is really about, and the data on this, and contribute in any way you can.
All right. Last link I'm going to share is to Critica Science. I just realized we didn't even drop that in today. So that's your organization, and you can get your book and your talks and so on
Mhm.
Critica. So last thing to mention is that Those Nerdy Girls does have a newsletter. So if you want to stay up to date with our content on all various public health topics, from guns to COVID, reproductive health, make sure to go to our website at thosenerdygirls.org, and that's also where you will find our question box. So you can submit questions. Those will guide our posts and also guide future Q&A sessions. So thank you so much for being here and joining us to learn about gun violence, and we hope to see you again next time. Take care.